If you are listening to this right now, I want you to pause everything else for just a moment, because what I am about to tell you is not a normal family story. It is about silence being used as a weapon, and how quiet people are often the most dangerous ones in the room. 3 days after my father's funeral, while everyone was still pretending to grieve, my brother-in-law leaned close to me and told me to stay silent if I knew what was good for me. He thought grief had made me weak. He thought I did not understand what I had in my hands. He was wrong, because when people underestimate you, they reveal themselves. And once the truth is recorded, dated, and signed, silence stops being obedience and becomes strategy. Before I begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your state in the comments and stay with me, because what happened next still feels unreal every time I replay it in my head. My name is Emily. I am 30 years old, and until recently, I believed silence was something you used to survive difficult moments. I grew up in Ohio in a family where keeping the peace mattered more than telling the truth. My father was the center of that world. He was calm, thoughtful, and careful with his words. When he passed away after a short illness, it felt like the only steady thing in my life disappeared overnight. The funeral was quiet, dignified, and full of people who suddenly had stories about how much they loved him. I stood beside my mother, holding her hand, doing what everyone expected me to do. I cried. I thanked people. I stayed composed. My brother-in-law Mark was there too. He had been married to my older sister for 10 years, and he always knew how to take up space in a room. He spoke loudly, laughed at the wrong moments, and acted like he was in charge even when he was not. At the funeral, he played the role of the supportive family man perfectly. He hugged people, handed out tissues, and spoke about my father as if they had been inseparable. I noticed how often he glanced in my direction, like he was measuring something. 3 days later, the family gathered at my parents' house to go through paperwork and personal belongings. The house still smelled like my father's coffee. His jacket was still hanging by the door. Every small detail made it harder to breathe. We sat around the dining table, stacks of folders between us, waiting for the lawyer to arrive later that week. It was supposed to be an informal meeting, just family, just memories. That was when Mark asked me to step into the kitchen with him. His tone was casual, almost friendly. As soon as we were alone, his voice dropped. He told me this was a sensitive time and that not everything needed to be discussed openly. He said emotions could cause misunderstandings. Then he looked me straight in the eyes and told me it would be better for everyone if I stayed silent about what I knew. I did not ask him what he meant. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I just listened. Inside, something shifted. My father had always told me that when someone rushes to quiet you, it is because they are afraid of what you might say. Mark assumed I was grieving, distracted, and unaware. He did not realize that months earlier, my father had trusted me with information he never shared with anyone else. I nodded, thanked him for his concern, and walked back to the table. Mark smiled, clearly satisfied. What he did not know was that my silence was not compliance. It was preparation. And from that moment on, every word he spoke only added weight to the evidence I was about to let speak for me. In the days that followed, I stayed exactly the way Mark expected me to be: quiet, polite, agreeable. I showed up when I was supposed to, answered questions briefly, and avoided eye contact during conversations that drifted toward money or decisions. From the outside, I looked like a woman still processing grief. On the inside, I was organizing facts, dates, and documents with the same care my father had taught me when I was young. He believed that the truth did not need volume. It needed structure. My father and I had been close in the last year of his life. As his health declined, he became more deliberate about everything. One afternoon, months before he passed, he asked me to help him review some personal records. He said he trusted my attention to detail. At the time, I thought it was just about simplifying things. Now I understood it was about protection. He showed me folders labeled in his handwriting, explained why certain decisions were made, and asked me to remember what mattered if questions ever came up. He never accused anyone directly. He did not need to. He simply said that people behave differently when they believe no one is watching. Mark began to test boundaries almost immediately. He spoke on behalf of my sister without asking her. He volunteered to manage conversations with the lawyer. He made comments about efficiency and unity, as if those words gave him authority. Each time I said nothing. Each time I observed. I noticed how his version of events shifted depending on who was in the room. I noticed how he avoided specifics and rushed past details. These were not mistakes. They were patterns. One evening, my sister called me in tears. She said Mark was stressed and overwhelmed and that we should not make things harder for him. She asked me to be patient and understanding. I told her I was. That was true. I was patient. I was understanding. I understood exactly what was happening. Mark believed silence meant agreement. He believed I would not challenge him because I did not want conflict. He believed wrong. What Mark never considered was that my father had prepared for this. Among the records he gave me were copies of emails, handwritten notes, and a digital file with timestamps. My father had explained how to verify everything independently. He told me that truth holds up best when it does not rely on emotion. He also told me not to rush. He said timing matters just as much as accuracy. As the week moved closer to the formal meeting with the lawyer, Mark grew more confident. He spoke more freely, interrupted more often, and treated decisions as if they were already made. I watched him build a narrative in real time. I let him. Every assumption he made added another layer to the story he would later have to defend. I went home each night and reviewed the evidence again. I checked dates. I listened to recordings. I compared versions of the same conversation. There were no gaps. There were no assumptions. Just facts. By the time the lawyer confirmed the meeting, I was ready. Mark thought silence meant safety. I knew it meant leverage. The morning of the meeting with the lawyer arrived with a quiet intensity that made my chest tighten. I woke early, dressed carefully in neutral colors, and made sure every folder I needed was organized and within reach. The house was still heavy with the weight of my father's absence, but I moved through it with purpose. Every step, every breath, was deliberate. I had rehearsed this moment in my mind countless times, imagining how Mark would behave, how my sister would react, and how I would present the truth. I reminded myself that confidence comes from preparation, not anger. When I arrived at the lawyer's office, Mark was already there. He was smiling, shaking hands, and attempting small talk with anyone who would listen. He believed he had control. He believed everyone would see him as the calm, rational family member. I greeted him politely, took my seat, and opened my folders quietly. From the outside, it looked like an ordinary meeting, but inside, the tension was palpable. I felt my father's guidance with me. I knew that my role was not to argue, to raise my voice, or to accuse. My role was to let the evidence speak for itself. The lawyer began with formalities, reviewing the will and explaining the steps we would take to finalize everything. Mark tried to interject several times, offering explanations, interpretations, and suggestions. I let him speak. I did not react. I did not flinch. Every word he said, every claim he made, was being catalogued in my mind. The more he spoke, the more the truth became visible. My sister looked at him with tentative approval, nodding at points he emphasized. She did not realize that the very points he was proud of were the ones that would later reveal his mistakes. Finally, the lawyer asked if anyone had questions or concerns about the documents. I placed my folder on the table and spoke clearly, calmly, and without hesitation. I said that I had reviewed several documents provided by my father over the last year and that I had notes, emails, and dated records that I believed were important for everyone to see. Mark's smile faltered, his confident posture shifted, and I could feel the room change. Silence followed for a moment as the weight of what I was about to reveal settled over the table. I began presenting the evidence systematically. Each folder contained correspondence, recorded conversations, and annotated notes that showed inconsistencies in Mark's statements, attempts to influence decisions, and assumptions he had made about control and inheritance. I did not comment, judge, or speculate. I allowed each piece of evidence to demonstrate the truth. Every email had a timestamp. Every note was in my father's handwriting. Every record was verifiable. I could see Mark's hands tighten on the table. I could see the panic flicker in his eyes. What struck me most was how quickly the narrative shifted. People who had trusted his words without question were now listening, taking notes, and asking questions. My sister looked at me with a mixture of relief and astonishment. The lawyer nodded, reviewing each piece methodically. Mark tried to respond, tried to explain, but each defense only reinforced the clarity of the evidence. The meeting became less about opinion and more about fact. I realized then that power does not come from volume or confidence alone. Power comes from preparation, observation, and the courage to act at the right moment. By the end of the morning, the foundation had been laid. The evidence was undeniable. Mark had assumed silence would protect him. I had assumed patience and diligence would protect me. The balance of control had shifted without me raising my voice or showing anger. And in that moment, I understood that my father had not only left me documents, he had left me a strategy that would allow the truth to speak louder than anyone's assumptions, arrogance, or deceit. The hours after the meeting were tense but quietly satisfying. I went home and sat in my father's study, surrounded by the smell of old books and the faint scent of his coffee mug that still lingered on the desk. I reviewed every piece of evidence again, making sure I understood every detail, every nuance, every date and signature. Mark had no idea that the moment he had underestimated me was also the moment he had lost control. I did not feel triumph in a loud way. I felt calm, precise, and certain. That calmness was far more powerful than anger could ever be. Later that afternoon, Mark called my sister. I overheard the conversation as I passed by the living room. His tone was measured, but the tension in his voice was unmistakable. He was trying to explain, trying to justify, trying to regain influence over a situation that had already moved beyond his control. I did not intervene. I did not offer advice. I allowed him to reveal himself to the person he trusted most. And as he spoke, I could hear the subtle frustration, the realization that every argument he had prepared for was being dismantled by facts. Every claim he had made was now under scrutiny, and he had no clear defense. My sister came to me later that evening. Her expression was a mixture of shock, relief, and a hint of guilt. She said that she had never realized how much had been happening behind the scenes. She thanked me for handling everything with care, precision, and patience. I reminded her that we were not finished. This was only the beginning. The lawyer would review everything, verify all documents, and ensure that the correct decisions were made according to my father's wishes. Patience, observation, and evidence would continue to guide every next step. Over the next few days, Mark tried to assert control in small ways, contacting other family members, sending messages to friends, and even attempting to influence minor decisions regarding property and assets. I allowed him to continue. Each action was a mistake on his part because every message, every attempt at persuasion, was being documented. My father's careful instructions had ensured that these records could be verified independently. I did not need to confront him directly. I simply let the situation unfold, and it became clear that the truth was too structured, too thorough, and too verified to be challenged effectively. One evening, I reviewed an old recording my father had made. In it, he explained why he had chosen to provide me with guidance, records, and oversight. He spoke calmly, deliberately, and with clarity, emphasizing the importance of patience and observation. Listening to his voice, I understood fully that my actions were not revenge. They were alignment with his strategy. Mark had assumed he could control outcomes by silencing me. I had assumed that by carefully following my father's guidance, I could ensure justice, fairness, and clarity without confrontation. The strategy was working, and the results were evident. By the time the formal review with the lawyer occurred, the foundation of truth was unshakable. Mark attempted to interject, but each comment he made only reinforced the accuracy and importance of the evidence I had presented. Family members who had previously deferred to his confidence now sought clarification from me, and I responded with calm, precise, and verifiable information. The shift in influence was undeniable. Silence had not been weakness. It had been preparation. Patience had not been passivity. It had been strategy. And the moment had arrived when the truth would finally speak for itself, leaving no room for assumption, arrogance, or control. The day of final review arrived with a quiet intensity that made my heart race, though I maintained my composure. I entered the lawyer's office with all folders organized, evidence highlighted, and my mind focused on clarity and precision. Mark was already there, his confident smile strained slightly, a shadow of unease flickering across his face. He had believed he could control the narrative, that he could continue to manipulate everyone with charm and volume. He did not realize that preparation, patience, and truth were far more powerful than arrogance. The lawyer began by summarizing the documents and reviewing the steps that would finalize the estate. I observed carefully, listening to Mark's interjections and noting how quickly his explanations began to falter under the weight of evidence. When it was my turn, I spoke calmly and methodically, presenting each folder, each email, and each handwritten note in order. I did not raise my voice or show emotion. I allowed the clarity of the facts to speak louder than words. Every timestamp, every signature, and every record demonstrated the reality of what had occurred behind the scenes. Mark's confidence waned visibly as the room absorbed the truth. I could see the reactions of family members shift in real time. My sister, who had been hesitant and anxious, now looked at me with understanding and trust. The lawyer reviewed each document meticulously, confirming dates, authenticity, and sequence. Mark attempted to interrupt, trying to justify actions that were clearly contradicted by the evidence. Each attempt only reinforced the truth. Every statement I presented aligned perfectly with the records my father had prepared. Silence, observation, and preparation had transformed into undeniable authority. As the review concluded, the lawyer spoke directly to Mark, outlining inconsistencies and clarifying that the official records and my father's explicit instructions took precedence. Mark's attempts to assert influence were no longer effective. The room was quiet, the tension thick, and the power dynamic had shifted completely. I felt a calm satisfaction knowing that the truth had not only been revealed, but that it was undeniable. No assumptions, no charm, no manipulation could alter what had been verified with precision. Walking out of the lawyer's office, I realized how much had changed in those few days. My father's foresight had provided me with guidance, evidence, and strategy. Mark's arrogance and assumptions had created his own undoing. Silence had not been submission. Patience had not been passivity. Observation had not been inaction. I had honored my father's trust, safeguarded my family's integrity, and ensured that justice was executed through careful planning rather than confrontation. That evening, sitting alone in the house, I reflected on the experience. I understood now that true power does not come from raising your voice or dominating a room. True power comes from understanding, preparation, and the courage to act at the right time. I had allowed the evidence to speak, and it had spoken louder than anyone could argue with. My brother-in-law had underestimated me. He had assumed grief would make me compliant. He had assumed silence was weakness. He was wrong. The truth, methodically and patiently presented, had rewritten the narrative. I had honored my father, protected my family, and claimed authority not through aggression, but through unwavering clarity, precision, and the strategic patience he had taught me. From that day forward, I understood that the lessons my father had imparted were far more than about paperwork or records. They were about life, trust, and the power of preparation. I had seen firsthand how knowledge, patience, and courage could shift outcomes, even in moments of grief and family tension. And I knew that no one would ever underestimate me again. The evidence had spoken. I had listened. And the world had responded.